My name is Maya Thompson, and 3 months ago I thought the biggest surprise in my life would be discovering I was 12% Irish instead of the German heritage my family always talked about. I was completely wrong. What I discovered at what was supposed to be a fun Saturday afternoon DNA reveal party changed everything I thought I knew about who I was, where I came from, and the people I called mom and dad for 28 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started as Jessica's idea. She'd been obsessed with genealogy ever since her grandmother passed away, and left behind a shoebox full of old photographs with no names written on the back. "Come on, Maya," she'd said, bouncing on her toes in that way she does when she gets excited about something. "It'll be like a surprise party, but instead of cake, we get to find out if we're secretly related to royalty or serial killers." She laughed at her own joke, but I could see she was serious about wanting answers. The plan was simple. 6 of us from college would each take a DNA test, wait for the results, and then gather at Jessica's place in Scottsdale for what she called a heritage reveal party. She'd even made custom t-shirts that said "Who's your DNA D" in glittery letters that she was way too proud of. Looking back now, those shirts seem almost mocking, like the universe was setting up the cruelest punchline imaginable. The morning I spit into that little plastic tube, I was sitting at my kitchen table in my Tempe apartment, still wearing the oversized Arizona State t-shirt I'd slept in. The instructions seemed straightforward enough: no food or drink for an hour before, fill the tube to the line, screw on the cap, shake it up and mail it off. I remember thinking it was weird how something so simple could unlock decades of family history. I sealed it in the prepaid envelope and dropped it in the mailbox on my way to work, not giving it another thought for weeks. My life in Phoenix was exactly what I'd planned it to be after graduating from ASU. I worked as a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized advertising agency downtown, spent my weekends hiking South Mountain or lounging by the community pool at my apartment complex, and had dinner with my parents every Sunday at their house in Chandler. David and Linda Thompson had given me everything a daughter could ask for: a stable childhood, college tuition paid in full, unwavering support for every dream I'd ever chased, and enough love to make me feel like the luckiest person in Arizona. Dad worked as an electrician for the city, and Mom managed the front office at a pediatric dental practice. They'd been married for 32 years, met at a bowling alley when they were both 21, and still held hands during movies. Our family photos lined the hallway of their ranch-style house, showing camping trips to Sedona, my high school graduation, birthday parties, and Christmas mornings. It was the kind of family that people write greeting cards about: wholesome and uncomplicated and real. The only unusual thing about my childhood, if you could even call it that, was how often we moved when I was little. According to family stories, we'd lived in Flagstaff until I was 4, then Phoenix, then briefly in Tucson, then back to Phoenix for good. Mom always said Dad's work required the moves, and I never questioned it. Kids don't question things like that, they just adapt and assume whatever their parents tell them is normal. I'd always looked like them, or at least that's what everyone said. I had Dad's green eyes and Mom's straight brown hair, though mine was darker. People at the grocery store or parent-teacher conferences would comment on how much I resembled Linda, especially when I smiled. I took those observations as fact, never thinking to examine the details too closely. Why would I? These were my parents, my family, my entire foundation. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday in early March. I was at work when the email notification popped up on my phone: "Your ancestry results are ready." I felt a little flutter of excitement, remembering Jessica's party was still 5 days away. I decided to wait and open them with everyone else, like we'd planned. That restraint, that decision to wait, sometimes feels like the last moment of my old life. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of perfect Arizona weather that makes you remember why people move here. Jessica's backyard was set up like a miniature festival, with string lights hung between the palm trees, a folding table covered in snacks, and a kiddie pool filled with ice and beer. She'd even created individualized envelopes for each of us to put our printed results in, decorated with our names in metallic markers. It was exactly the kind of over-the-top celebration that made Jessica who she was. The 6 of us gathered around her patio table as the sun started to set behind the mountains. There was me, Jessica, our friends Ryan and Amanda from college, plus 2 of Jessica's coworkers I'd met a few times before. Everyone was laughing and making jokes about what we might discover. Ryan was convinced he'd find out he was descended from Vikings. Amanda was hoping for some exotic ancestry that would explain her love of spicy food. Jessica wanted confirmation that her family's stories about Italian heritage were true. I was the third person to open my results. Ryan had found out he was mostly German and Swedish, which disappointed him greatly. Amanda discovered she was predominantly Mexican and Spanish, which thrilled her. Then it was my turn. I tore open the envelope with everyone watching, pulled out the folded papers, and started reading aloud. "Okay, let's see what we've got here," I said, scanning the first page. Ethnicity estimate, 52% Northern European, which tracks with what we thought. 28%, wait. I stopped reading and looked at the paper more carefully. Something was wrong with the numbers. They didn't look right. "What is it?" Jessica asked, leaning over to see. I continued reading, but my voice started to sound strange, even to myself. 28% Sub-Saharan African, 12% Native American, 8%. This can't be right. I flipped through the pages, looking for some kind of explanation or error notice. The percentages weren't anywhere close to what I'd expected. More importantly, they weren't even slightly similar to what my parents' ancestry should be. "Maybe there was a mix-up at the lab," Amanda suggested, but she was looking at me with concern now instead of curiosity. I turned to the next section, DNA relatives. This was supposed to be the fun part, where we discovered distant cousins and maybe solve some family mysteries. Instead, I found something that made my stomach drop. The closest match showed a 50% DNA overlap.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
With someone named Marcus Williams. 50% meant immediate family. The relationship was listed as close family, parent-child, or full sibling. Who's Marcus Williams? I asked, though I was really asking myself. I'd never heard that name in my life. The conversation around the table had stopped completely. Everyone was staring at me now, and I could feel heat rising in my cheeks. This was supposed to be entertaining, not terrifying. I kept reading through the relative matches, finding names that meant nothing to me but showed genetic connections that shouldn't exist. Karen Williams, listed as a potential aunt or half-sibling. Patricia Williams, possible grandmother or great-aunt. A whole family tree of people I'd never met but was apparently related to. "Maybe you should call your parents," Jessica suggested quietly. The party atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of tension that makes everyone uncomfortable. I nodded, trying to process what I was looking at. The results were clearly wrong, had to be wrong, because the alternative was impossible. I'd grown up with David and Linda Thompson. They were at my birth, raised me, loved me, taught me to drive, helped me with homework, celebrated every birthday and milestone. These results were just a mistake, a laboratory error that would be embarrassing to tell my parents about later but ultimately meaningless. But as I sat there in Jessica's backyard, surrounded by friends who didn't know what to say, I realized I was already starting to doubt everything I thought I knew about myself. The percentages were too specific, too detailed to be a simple mix-up. And that 50% match with Marcus Williams felt like a neon sign pointing toward a truth I wasn't ready to face. I folded the papers back up and put them in my purse, forcing a smile that probably looked as fake as it felt. "You're right," I told Jessica. "I'll figure this out with my parents tomorrow. Probably just a lab error." Everyone nodded and agreed, but the party never recovered its energy. We went through the motions of celebrating Ryan's Viking disappointment and Amanda's spice-loving genetics, but the mood had shifted. I left earlier than planned, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. During the drive home to my apartment, I kept telling myself it was a mistake. Labs made errors all the time. Maybe someone else's DNA got mixed up with mine. Maybe the sample was contaminated. Maybe the whole ancestry testing industry was less reliable than their marketing suggested. These were logical explanations, reasonable doubts, and I clung to them like life preservers. But I couldn't shake the image of that 50% match with Marcus Williams. 50% was too precise, too significant to dismiss. It meant I shared half my genetic material with someone whose name I'd never heard before, someone who should be my parent or sibling if the science was correct. That night, I spread the DNA results across my coffee table and read through them again, more carefully this time. The technical details were overwhelming, full of chromosome segments and genetic markers that meant nothing to me. But the basic facts were clear. According to this test, I was genetically connected to a family named Williams, and I shared virtually no DNA with anyone named Thompson. I tried calling my parents' house 3 times before remembering they'd gone to Sedona for the weekend, one of their regular getaways to the bed and breakfast where they'd spent their honeymoon. I'd have to wait until Sunday to ask them about the results, which gave me 2 days to spiral into increasingly wild theories about what might have happened. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through every family story I'd ever been told, looking for cracks or inconsistencies I might have missed. The moves when I was little, the lack of extended family on both sides, the way my parents had always been vague about specific details from my early childhood. Things that had seemed perfectly normal before now felt suspicious, like pieces of a puzzle I'd never realized I was supposed to be solving. By Sunday morning, I'd convinced myself that I was being ridiculous. DNA tests weren't infallible. Families didn't just lie about fundamental things like parentage. I was Maya Thompson, daughter of David and Linda, and whatever error had occurred at the testing facility would be resolved with a simple phone call to customer service. But as I drove to my parents' house for our weekly dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about Marcus Williams and what it would mean if that 50% match was real. If the DNA results were accurate, then everything I believed about my identity was built on something other than biological truth. The possibility was terrifying enough to make my hands shake as I parked in their driveway. I sat in my car for several minutes, looking at the house where I'd spent countless Sunday dinners, birthday celebrations, and family gatherings. The desert landscaping was perfect as always, with carefully arranged succulents and a small fountain that gurgled peacefully near the front door. This was home, the place where I belonged, and I was about to walk inside and ask questions that might change everything. The DNA results were still in my purse, folded up like a secret I wasn't ready to share. But I knew I couldn't pretend they didn't exist. Whatever was in those papers, whatever truth they represented or mistake they contained, I had to find out what it meant. Even if it meant discovering that the life I'd always known wasn't entirely real. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and walked toward the front door, not knowing that this would be the last Sunday dinner where I could still pretend to be exactly who I thought I was. The front door opened before I could knock, and Mom appeared with her usual bright smile, wearing the turquoise earrings Dad had bought her for their anniversary last month. She looked so normal, so perfectly like the mother I'd known my entire life, that for a moment I wondered if I should just throw the DNA results away and pretend none of this had ever happened. "Sweetheart, how was Jessica's party yesterday? Did you find out you're secretly descended from royalty?" She laughed and pulled me into a hug that smelled like her usual vanilla perfume and the lavender fabric softener she'd used for as long as I could remember. Everything about her was familiar, comforting, exactly as it had always been. Dad called from the kitchen. "Maya's here. Tell her I'm making those enchiladas she likes." His voice carried the same warmth it always did, the sound of a man who was genuinely happy to see his daughter. These were not the voices of people harboring dark secrets. These were my parents, the same people who had bandaged my scraped knees, taught me to ride a bike, and stayed up all night with me when I had pneumonia in 6th grade. "Actually, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "the DNA thing was kind of interesting. Can we talk about it over dinner?" She studied my face for a moment, and I caught something that might have been concern flickering across her features, but it passed so quickly, I might have imagined it. "Of course, honey. Everything okay?" "Yeah, just some unexpected results that made me curious about our family history." We walked into the kitchen, where Dad was stirring a pot of red sauce, his gray hair slightly messed from the steam. He turned and grinned at me, flour dusting the front of his ASU t-shirt. "There's my girl. How's the marketing world treating you this week?" For the next hour, we fell into our usual Sunday routine. Dad finished cooking, while Mom and I set the table and caught up on neighborhood gossip. She told me about Mrs. Henderson's new puppy that kept digging up her flower beds, and Dad complained good-naturedly about the irrigation system that needed constant repairs. It was perfectly ordinary, exactly like hundreds of other Sunday dinners we'd shared. But underneath the normalcy, I felt like I was watching everything from a distance, as if I were an actor who had suddenly forgotten her lines. Every family photo on the refrigerator, every shared memory they referenced, every casual gesture of affection felt both completely real and somehow questionable. The DNA results in my purse seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, demanding attention I wasn't ready to give. When we finally sat down to eat, I pulled out the folded papers with hands that trembled slightly. "So remember how Jessica organized that DNA test party thing? Well, I got some results that don't really make sense. Dad looked up from his enchiladas. What kind of results? The ancestry breakdown is completely different from what I expected. And there are these DNA matches with people I've never heard of. I unfolded the papers and placed them on the table between us. There's someone named Marcus Williams, who shows up as an immediate family member. 50% DNA match. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Mom's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Dad's eyes moved to her face before returning to the papers. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was enough to send ice through my veins. Well, Mom said carefully, you know those tests aren't always accurate. I read an article about twins who got completely different results from the same company. But this isn't about ethnicity percentages, I said, watching their faces closely. This is about genetic relatives. According to this, I'm closely related to several people named Williams, close enough that one of them should be my parent or sibling. Dad reached for the papers and scanned them quickly. His expression was neutral, but I noticed he was gripping them tighter than necessary. This Marcus Williams, it says he's in Tucson. You know him? The question came out sharper than I intended. No, just wondering if maybe it's someone from when we lived there briefly, when you were little. Sometimes people get these distant connections that seem closer than they really are. I'd heard Dad explain complicated things thousands of times throughout my childhood, and I knew his voice intimately. This wasn't his normal explanation voice. This was the voice he used when he was choosing his words very carefully. The same tone he'd used when he told me our dog had gone to live on a farm upstate when I was 8. But 50% isn't distant, I pressed. That's immediate family level. Parent, child, or full sibling. Mom set down her fork completely and looked at Dad with an expression I couldn't read. They seemed to be having some kind of silent conversation that I wasn't part of. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Honey, Mom finally said, maybe we should call the testing company tomorrow. Explain the situation. I'm sure they can sort out whatever mix-up happened. What if it's not a mix-up? Another pause, longer this time. What do you mean? Dad asked. I mean, what if the results are accurate? What if I really am related to these Williams people? I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded, because inside I felt like I was falling. Mom reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Maya, you're our daughter. You've been our daughter since the day you were born. These test results, whatever they say, they don't change that. There was something in the way she phrased it that made my stomach clench. Since the day you were born, not from the day you were born. It was probably nothing, just imprecise language, but it felt significant in a way I couldn't ignore. I know that, I said. I'm not questioning whether you're my parents. I'm just trying to understand why my DNA says I'm related to people I've never met. Dad stood up abruptly and started clearing dishes, even though we hadn't finished eating. Sometimes these things are just mistakes, lab errors, sample contamination, computer glitches. The important thing is family, not what some computer printout said. I watched him move around the kitchen with unusual energy, loading the dishwasher with more attention than dirty plates typically required. He was avoiding eye contact, and his shoulders were tense in a way that suggested stress rather than casual dinner cleanup. Dad, sit down. We need to talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, he said. But he sat back down anyway. I looked at both of them, really looked, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was seeing strangers wearing my parents' faces. They were scared, not confused, not concerned about a laboratory error, but genuinely frightened in a way that suggested they knew exactly what the DNA results meant. You're not telling me something, I said. Mom's voice was gentle but firm. Some things are better left alone. What thing? What aren't you telling me? They looked at each other again, and I saw Dad give an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Mom's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. We love you, she said finally. That's the most important thing. Whatever else you think you need to know, that's the truth that matters. I felt something break inside my chest, a crack that started small but spread quickly. That's not an answer. It's the only answer we can give you right now, Dad said. I stood up from the table. The DNA results still spread between us like evidence in a trial. So there is something you're not telling me. Neither of them spoke. Is Marcus Williams my brother? I asked. Is that why you won't look at me? Mom made a sound that might have been a sob, quickly stifled. I'm going home, I said. When you're ready to tell me the truth, call me. I grabbed my purse and walked toward the front door, hoping one of them would stop me, would call out and explain everything in a way that made sense. But they didn't. They let me leave with questions hanging in the air like smoke, and that silence told me more than any explanation could have. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of streetlights and stop signs that barely registered. I kept replaying the conversation, analyzing every word, every pause, every facial expression. My parents knew something about the DNA results, something they weren't willing to share. The people who had raised me to value honesty above almost everything else had just lied to my face, or at least refused to tell me a truth I deserved to know. Back in my apartment, I spread the DNA results across my coffee table again, and stared at Marcus Williams' name until it started to look formed. 50% genetic match. Brother or parent. Someone who shared half my chromosomes but had never been part of my life. I opened my laptop and created an account on the DNA company's website, where I could access more detailed information about my genetic relative. Marcus Williams had a public profile with a photo, a man who looked to be in his early 30s. Yes, with dark hair and green eyes that were unmistakably similar to mine. His profile said he lived in Tucson and worked as a high school math teacher. He looked like me, not in the way people sometimes say family members resemble each other, but in a way that was undeniable and startling. We had the same nose, the same jawline, the same slightly crooked smile. If someone had shown me his photo without context, I would have assumed he was a cousin I'd never met. I clicked through his family tree, which was public, and found Karen Williams listed as his mother. Her photo showed a woman in her 50s with graying brown hair and kind eyes. She looked like someone who might work as a nurse or elementary school teacher, someone's favorite aunt, or the neighbor who always had fresh cookies. She looked like someone I should know. According to the family tree, Karen Williams had been born in Flagstaff in 1970. Flagstaff, where my parents said we'd lived when I was little. The coincidence felt too precise to be accidental. I spent the next 2 hours diving deeper into public records and social media profiles, learning everything I could about the Williams family. Marcus had graduated from Northern Arizona University with a degree in mathematics. Karen worked as a receptionist at a medical clinic in Tucson. They both posted frequently about family gatherings, hiking trips, and a close-knit extended family that included aunts, uncles, and cousins who all seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. It was the kind of warm, connected family that posted group photos from holiday celebrations and shared inside jokes in the comments. The kind of family that looked like they'd never lost touch with each other, never had mysterious gaps in their history or convenient explanations for missing pieces of the past. As I scrolled through years of photos, I found myself searching their faces for traces of my own features. The resemblance to Marcus was obvious, but I could see echoes of myself and other relatives too. Karen's sister had my hands, an uncle had my eyebrows, a teenage cousin had my exact smile. By midnight, I had mapped out 3 generations of the Williams family tree and confirmed that they were all exactly who they appeared to be, a normal Arizona family with roots going back decades, steady jobs, and no apparent secrets or mystery. They were everything my own family had always seemed to be, except they had the genetic proof to back it up. I closed my laptop and tried to process what I'd learned. Either the DNA test was catastrophically wrong in multiple ways, or I was somehow connected to this family in a way that made no biological sense given my upbringing. The evidence was pointing toward one conclusion that I wasn't ready to accept, that David and Linda Thompson might not be my biological parents. The thought was absurd. I had baby photos, childhood memories, 28 years of shared experiences. I had their love, their guidance, their genetic traits visible in my own face. Except now that I was looking more carefully, I wasn't sure about those genetic traits anymore. My green eyes could have come from Marcus Williams just as easily as from David. My hair color was actually closer to Karen Williams than to Mom. I went to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror, the same mirror where I'd examined my reflection thousands of times throughout my life. Tonight, for the first time, I looked like a stranger. The face staring back at me belonged to someone who might be a Williams instead of a Thompson, someone whose entire identity might be built on a foundation that wasn't quite solid. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't imagine sitting in meetings and discussing marketing campaigns while my entire understanding of myself was unraveling. Instead, I drove to the Chandler Public Library and spent the day researching everything I could about DNA testing, genetic inheritance, and family secrets. What I learned was both comforting and terrifying. False positive results were extremely rare, especially for close genetic relationships. A 50% match was one of the most reliable indicators in genetic testing, virtually impossible to fake or misinterpret. If Marcus Williams and I shared 50% of our DNA, we were definitely immediate family members. I also learned about something called non-paternity events, a clinical term for situations where a child's biological father isn't who the family believes it to be. But that didn't explain my connection to the Williams family, since the DNA suggested multiple relatives, not just one parent. By late afternoon, I had filled a notebook with questions and theories, but I was no closer to understanding what had actually happened. The only people who could give me real answers were my parents, and they had made it clear they weren't ready to provide them. I drove home feeling like I was caught between two different realities. In one reality, I was Maya Thompson, beloved daughter of David and Linda, living the life I'd always known and understood. In the other reality, I was someone else entirely, a person with genetic connections to strangers, and a history that had been hidden from me for reasons I couldn't begin to imagine. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I doubted my parents' love, not their current love, which I knew was real and deep and unwavering. But I wondered about the beginning, about the circumstances that had brought me into their lives, about the decisions they'd made, and the truths they'd chosen to keep from me. For the first time since Saturday's DNA party, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that everything I thought I knew about my origins might be wrong. The idea was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. If my identity wasn't what I'd always believed, then maybe I had the chance to discover who I really was, even if that discovery meant losing the certainty I'd always taken for granted. I fell asleep that night, clutching the DNA results, knowing that whatever came next would require courage. I wasn't
sure I possessed, but I also knew I couldn't live with the questions anymore. I needed answers, even if those answers changed everything. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crushing Arizona heat that makes you question why anyone chose to live in the desert. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my office building, air conditioning blasting, trying to summon the energy to walk inside and pretend I cared about quarterly marketing reports when my entire world felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom, "Thinking about you, sweetheart. Let's talk soon." It was the third message she'd sent since Sunday dinner, each one carefully worded to sound normal while avoiding any mention of DNA results or difficult questions. Dad had called once, leaving a voicemail about a new restaurant they wanted to try, his voice determinedly cheerful in a way that felt forced. They were giving me space, but it was the kind of space that felt loaded with unspoken anxiety. The kind of space parents give when they're hoping a problem will resolve itself without requiring difficult conversations. I'd spent my entire life being grateful for their thoughtful, gentle approach to conflict, but now it felt like avoidance. Inside the office, I went through the motions of my job with the kind of autopilot efficiency that comes from doing something for years. I responded to emails about social media campaigns, attended a meeting about brand positioning for a local restaurant chain, and reviewed mock-ups for a billboard advertisement. But underneath the professional competence, my mind was completely elsewhere. During lunch break, I found myself Googling adoption procedures in Arizona, trying to understand the legal processes that might explain how I could be genetically connected to the Williams family while being raised by the Thompsons. What I discovered was a complex web of regulations, waiting periods, and documentation requirements that seemed designed to create permanent paper trails. Modern adoptions, especially those processed through official agencies, generated extensive records. Birth certificates, court documents, agency files, medical histories, and background checks created layers of documentation that were difficult to falsify or lose completely. The more I read, the less likely it seemed that any legitimate adoption could have occurred without leaving traces I could follow. But I also learned about informal adoptions, family arrangements, and situations where children were transferred between relatives or close friends without formal legal processes. These kinds of arrangements, especially those that occurred decades ago, might not have created the same extensive paper trails. They might explain how someone could grow up believing one thing about their parentage while genetic testing revealed something completely different. The research was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. Each article I read opened new possibilities while eliminating others. By the end of my lunch hour, I had a legal pad covered with notes about documentation, timelines, and procedures, but I was no closer to understanding my specific situation. Back at my desk, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and reckless. I was going to contact Marcus Williams directly. If he was really my brother, as the DNA results suggested, then he might have answers that my parents weren't willing to provide. It was a violation of every boundary I'd ever respected about family privacy, but I was past the point of polite restraint. The DNA website had a messaging system that allowed genetic relatives to contact each other. I spent an hour crafting and deleting messages, trying to find words that would explain my situation without sounding completely insane. How do you tell a stranger that you might be their long-lost sister when you're not even sure you believe it yourself? Finally, I settled on something simple. Hi Marcus, my name is Maya Thompson, and according to our DNA results we're closely related. I'm trying to understand my family history, and wondered if you might be willing to talk. I know this is unusual, but I'd appreciate any insight you might have. I hit send before I could change my mind, then immediately regretted the decision. What if he thought I was some kind of scammer? What if he contacted my parents before I was ready? What if he knew something about my origins that would shatter whatever remained of my sense of identity? The response came faster than I expected. Within 2 hours, my phone buzzed with a notification from the DNA website. Marcus Williams had replied, "Maya, I've been wondering when you might reach out. Yes, we should definitely talk. Are you free this evening? I can drive up from Tucson if you'd like to meet in person." I stared at the message for several minutes, reading it over and over. He'd been wondering when I might reach out. That suggested he already knew about our genetic connection, had probably been aware of it since his own DNA results arrived. It also suggested he knew more about the situation than I did. I typed back, "Yes, let's meet. There's a coffee shop called Copper Star on Mill Avenue in Tempe. 7 o'clock? I'll be there. I'll be wearing a blue ASU baseball cap. Looking forward to finally meeting you." Finally meeting me. The word choice felt significant, loaded with implications I couldn't quite grasp. It suggested this wasn't as much of a surprise to him as it was to me. The rest of the workday passed in a haze of nervous energy and second-guessing. I changed my mind about meeting Marcus at least a dozen times, but I couldn't bring myself to cancel. This might be my only chance to get answers from someone who didn't have a vested interest in protecting me from the truth. I left work early and drove home to change clothes, though I had no idea what was appropriate attire for meeting your potential long-lost brother. I settled on jeans and a simple blouse, nothing too formal but not too casual either. I wanted to look approachable but not desperate, curious but not unhinged. Copper Star Coffee was busy with the usual Tuesday evening crowd of college students and young professionals. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table near the back, away from the main foot traffic but with a clear view of the entrance. I ordered a chai latte I didn't want and tried to calm my racing heart. At exactly 7 o'clock, a man in a blue ASU cap walked through the door. Even from across the room, the resemblance was unmistakable. He had my nose, my jawline, the same way of scanning a room before committing to movement. When our eyes met, he smiled with recognition that felt both startling and familiar. He approached my table with the kind of careful confidence that suggested he was as nervous as I was but better at hiding it. "Maya?" "Yes, Marcus, it's good to meet you." He sat down across from me and removed his baseball cap, revealing dark hair that was slightly curly, like mine got when the humidity was high. "Though I guess technically it's good to see you again." "Again?" He nodded, studying my face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "You don't remember, do you? You were really little, I guess. 4, maybe 5 years old." My chest tightened. "I don't understand." Marcus leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that was so familiar I almost gasped. I did the same thing when I was thinking, had done it thousands of times throughout my life without knowing where the habit came from. "Maya, you're my little sister. My mom's been looking for you for 23 years. The words hit me like cold water. I'd expected this conversation to provide clarity, answers, maybe some gentle confirmation of what the DNA results suggested. I hadn't expected such a direct, unequivocal statement that contradicted everything I knew about my life. "That's impossible," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to myself. "I know it seems impossible. I can't imagine what this feels like for you." His voice was gentle, patient, like he'd rehearsed this conversation many times. But you're Eleanor Williams. You disappeared from our backyard in Flagstaff when you were 4 years old. Mom never stopped looking for you. Eleanor, the name hit something deep in my memory, a sound that felt almost familiar but just out of reach. Like hearing a song you knew you'd heard before but couldn't quite place. My name is Maya Thompson, I said, clinging to the one fact I was absolutely certain about. I know that's who you've been. But before that you were Eleanor. Ellie, you used to follow me around everywhere, always wanted to do whatever I was doing. You had this stuffed elephant you carried everywhere, called him Peanut. I felt something shift inside my chest, a flutter of recognition that I couldn't quite place. I don't remember any of that. You were really young when you disappeared. And sometimes kids block out traumatic memories. He paused, watching my face carefully. Maya, can I ask you something? Do you have any memories from before you were 5? Real memories, not just stories people told you. The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd never thought about it systematically before, but now that he was asking, I realized the answer was no. My earliest clear memory was starting kindergarten at age 5, walking into a classroom in Phoenix holding Mom's hand. Everything before that was fragments, impressions, stories I'd been told so many times they felt like memories. Not really, I admitted. Marcus nodded like this confirmed something he'd expected. That's what the psychologist said might happen. Trauma can cause memory gaps, especially in young children. What trauma? What are you talking about? He was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. Maya, I think your parents, the Thompsons, they might not have acquired you through legal channels. The euphemism was gentle but unmistakable. Acquired, not adopted, not fostered, not taken in through any official process. Acquired, like I was an object that had changed hands through means that couldn't be discussed openly. You're saying they kidnapped me. I don't know the details. I was only 7 when you disappeared. All I know is that one day you were playing in our backyard, and the next day you were gone. Mom called the police, there was a massive search, but you just vanished. No trace, no leads, nothing. I felt like I was drowning in information that didn't fit anywhere in my understanding of reality. This doesn't make sense. My parents aren't criminals. They're good people. They love me. I'm not saying they're bad people. Marcus said carefully. Maybe they were told you needed a home. Maybe they thought they were helping. But Maya, the way you disappeared, the way you just vanished without a trace, that doesn't happen accidentally. I stood up abruptly, needing space, needing air, needing something to make sense. I can't process this. This is too much. Marcus stood too, but he didn't try to stop me from moving. I know it's overwhelming. But Maya, my mom has been searching for you for over 2 decades. She never gave up hope that she'd find you someday. Karen Williams, yes, she's your mother. Your biological mother. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge to everything I'd ever believed about myself. I thought about the woman I'd seen in the online photos, the kind-faced receptionist who looked like she belonged in someone's family album. According to Marcus, she didn't just look like family. She was family. I need to think, I said. Of course, but Maya, can I give you her phone number? She's been waiting so long to hear from you. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation. Marcus wrote a number on a napkin and handed it to me along with his own contact information. There's something else, he said, as I prepared to leave. Mom kept your room exactly the way it was when you disappeared. She always believed you'd come home someday. I left the coffee shop, feeling like I was walking through someone else's life. The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and racing thoughts. Marcus Williams seemed genuine, his emotions appeared real, and his story was specific enough to be verifiable. But accepting what he'd told me meant accepting that my entire life was built on something other than truth. Back in my apartment, I sat on my couch, holding Karen Williams' phone number, trying to imagine what I would say to a woman who might be my biological mother. How do you begin a conversation like that? How do you bridge a gap of 23 years? I thought about Marcus's mention of my childhood room, preserved exactly as I'd left it. The image was both touching and heartbreaking, a monument to hope that most people would have given up decades ago. If his story was true, then Karen Williams had spent more than half her life believing her daughter would come home. But I also thought about my parents, David and Linda Thompson, who had raised me with such obvious love and care. If Marcus was right about the circumstances of my arrival in their lives, then they had made a decision 23 years ago that resulted in one family's devastating loss and another family's joy. They had built their happiness on someone else's grief. The thought was unbearable, but I couldn't dismiss it anymore. Too many pieces were falling into place, too many coincidences were aligning in ways that couldn't be explained by laboratory errors or mistaken identity. The DNA results, the resemblance to Marcus, the gaps in my early memories, my parents' evasive responses all pointed toward a truth I wasn't ready to accept, but could no longer ignore. I picked up my phone and dialed Mom's number, not sure what I was going to say, but knowing I needed to hear her voice. "Maya, I was just thinking about you. How are you feeling?" "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." A pause. "Of course, honey. What is it? Did you and Dad adopt me?" The silence stretched so long I thought the call might have dropped. When Mom finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "Maya, you're our daughter. You've always been our daughter." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Some questions don't have simple answers. This one does. "Did you adopt me, yes or no?" "Maya, yes or no, Mom?" "It's complicated." "No, it's not. Either there's legal documentation of my adoption, or there isn't. Either you're my biological parents, or you're not." I heard her take a shaky breath. "Can we talk about this in person? Some conversations are too important for the phone." "Are David and Linda Thompson my biological parents?" The question hung in the air like a sword. When Mom finally answered, her voice was barely a whisper. "No." The word hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. Hearing the confirmation out loud made it real in a way that speculation and DNA results couldn't. Everything I'd believed about my identity, my origins, my family history was wrong. Who are my biological parents? "Maya, please, come home. Let us explain everything. Tell me now. I can't do this over the phone. Please, sweetheart, come home, and let us tell you the whole story." I ended the call without saying goodbye, my hands shaking too badly to hold the phone steady. The conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it had confirmed what I'd been afraid to believe. I wasn't Maya Thompson, at least not originally. I was someone else, someone who had been separated from her biological family under circumstances that my adoptive parents weren't willing to discuss openly. The apartment felt too small, too quiet, too full of questions I wasn't ready to face. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly through Phoenix, past strip malls and housing developments, trying to process what I'd learned and what it meant for every relationship I'd ever had. Somewhere in Tucson, a woman named Karen Williams was probably waiting by her phone, hoping her daughter would call after more than 2 decades of silence. Somewhere in Chandler, David and Linda Thompson were probably sitting in their living room, trying to figure out how to explain decisions they'd made when I was too young to remember. And somewhere between those two realities, I was driving through the desert night, trying to figure out who I was supposed to be now that I knew who I'd always thought I was, wasn't entirely true. I spent the next 3 days, avoiding everyone who cared about me. I called in sick to work, ignored texts from Jessica asking about weekend plans, and let my parents' increasingly worried voicemails pile up without response. Instead, I drove to places where no one knew me. A hiking trail in South Mountain, a bookstore in Scottsdale, a diner in Glendale, where I sat alone drinking coffee and trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to have too many missing pieces. On Friday morning, I finally worked up the courage to call the number Marcus had given me. Karen Williams answered on the second ring, and the sound of her voice made something inside my chest crack open. "Hello, is this Karen Williams?" "Yes, this is Karen. This is Maya Thompson. Marcus gave me your number." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "Ellie, is it really you?" Hearing that name again, spoken with such raw emotion, triggered something I wasn't prepared for. A flash of memory, brief but vivid, being lifted high in the air by someone with gentle hands, laughing as I was spun around in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon. The memory lasted only seconds, but it felt real in a way that all my Thompson family memories suddenly didn't. "I think so," I whispered. "Oh, sweetheart, I've been waiting for this call for so long." We talked for 2 hours. Karen's voice was patient and warm, never pushing for more than I was ready to share, but gradually filling in details that painted a picture of the life I'd apparently lived before becoming Maya Thompson. She told me about my favorite foods, the songs I used to sing, the way I insisted on wearing my red cowboy boots with every outfit. She described a little girl who was curious about everything, who asked endless questions and collected smooth rocks from the yard. You had this laugh, she said, this infectious giggle that could make anyone smile, even on their worst day. And you were so brave, always the first one to try something new. You learned to ride a bike without training wheels when you were 3 because you saw Marcus doing it and decided you could too. I found myself crying without realizing when it had started. These weren't my memories, but they felt like stories about someone I should have been, someone I might have been, if my life hadn't taken such an unexpected turn. What happened the day I disappeared? Karen's voice became careful, measured. You were playing in the backyard, while I was making lunch. We had a swing set back there, and you loved the monkey bars even though you were still too small to reach them easily. I went inside to answer the phone. It was my sister calling about our mother's birthday party. I couldn't have been gone more than 5 minutes. And when you came back, you were just gone. The gate was still latched. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of which direction you might have gone. It was like you'd simply vanished. I thought about what Marcus had implied, about the circumstances of my disappearance not being accidental. Do you think someone took me? The police investigated every possibility. They interviewed neighbors, checked with registered sex offenders in the area, put out Amber Alerts. But there were no witnesses, no evidence, no leads of any kind. After a few months, the active investigation was scaled back, but I never stopped looking. How did you look? Every way I could think of. I hired private investigators when I could afford them. I posted your picture on missing children websites. I drove to Phoenix and Tucson and Flagstaff, showing your photo to anyone who would look at it. I joined support groups for parents of missing children. I never gave up believing that someday I'd find you. The dedication in her voice was overwhelming. This woman had spent 23 years searching for a daughter who had been living 2 hours away, going to school, growing up, building a life under a different name. The tragedy of that near miss felt enormous. Karen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course, do you think David and Linda Thompson knew I was missing when they took me in? The pause was long enough to be an answer in itself. I don't know, sweetheart. I've thought about that question for years, and I honestly don't know. Maybe they were told you were abandoned, or that your parents couldn't care for you. Maybe someone lied to them too. It was a generous interpretation, more forgiving than I probably deserved, after the pain my absence had caused. But it also acknowledged a possibility. I desperately wanted to believe that my parents weren't villains in this story, just people who had made decisions based on incomplete or false information. Would you like to meet? Karen asked gently. I know this is overwhelming, and I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for, but I'd love to see you, to talk in person. I'd like that too. We arranged to meet the next day at a restaurant in Scottsdale, neutral territory that would give us both the option to leave if the meeting became too intense. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling like I was balanced on the edge of 2 different lives, not sure which direction I was supposed to follow. That evening, I finally returned my parents' calls. Dad answered, and his relief was audible. Maya, thank God, we've been so worried about you. I talked to Karen Williams today. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. I see, he said finally. She told me about the day I disappeared. About the 23 years she spent looking for me. Maya, there are things about that situation that you don't understand. Then explain them to me. Can you come over? This isn't a conversation for the phone. An hour later, I was sitting at my parents' kitchen table again, but everything felt different now. The family photos on the refrigerator looked like evidence instead of memories. The comfortable familiarity of the space felt tainted by the knowledge that my presence here had come at someone else's devastating cost. Mom's eyes were red and swollen, like she'd been crying for days. Dad looked older than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed to have appeared overnight. We never meant for anyone to get hurt. Mom said before I could ask any questions. But someone did get hurt. Karen Williams lost her daughter. Dad nodded heavily. We know that now. We didn't know it then. What did you know then? They looked at each other with the kind of silent communication that comes from decades of marriage, trying to decide how much truth I was ready to handle. There was a man, Dad said finally. A friend of a friend who knew we were hoping to adopt. We'd been on waiting lists for years, but we were too old for most agencies, and the process was so expensive and complicated. This man told us about a little girl who needed a home. Mom continued. He said your mother was very young, unable to care for you, and that she wanted a good family to raise you, but couldn't afford the legal costs of formal adoption. He said it was better to handle it privately. Dad added, less bureaucracy, less trauma for everyone involved. He said your mother specifically requested that there be no contact, that she wanted to start fresh and didn't want reminders of what she saw as a mistake. I felt sick listening to their explanation. So you just took someone's word for all of this? You never verified any of it. We wanted to believe it, Mom said quietly. We wanted a child so badly, and you were this beautiful, sweet little girl who seemed to need parents. It felt like fate. What about my birth certificate? My social security number? How did you handle the legal documentation? Dad's voice became even cold. The man said he could arrange all of that. He had connections with people who could make sure everything was properly documented. Forged, you mean? We didn't ask too many questions about the details. Mom admitted, we should have, but we didn't want to jeopardize the opportunity. I stared at them, trying to reconcile the people I'd always seen as models of integrity with the story they were telling me. They had knowingly participated in what amounted to child trafficking, even if they'd convinced themselves it was something more benign. Did it ever occur to you that I might have been kidnapped? Not at first, Dad said. You seemed happy enough, maybe a little confused, but not traumatized. You didn't cry for anyone, didn't ask about going home. We thought that confirmed what we'd been told about your situation. And later, Mom's voice broke. Later when you were older, and we loved you so much, we couldn't bear the thought that we might have to give you back. We told ourselves that they were better off with us, that we could give you things your biological family couldn't. You told yourselves a lot of things, I said, surprised by the anger in my own voice. Yes, Dad said simply. We did. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their confession settling between us like a physical presence. These people had raised me, loved me, given me every advantage they could provide. They had also stolen me from another family, and built their happiness on someone else's grief. What happened to the man who arranged everything? He disappeared about a year later, Dad said. We tried to contact him a few times when you started school, and we needed additional documentation, but he was just gone. Do you remember his name? Henderson. But that might not have been his real name. I filed that information away, though I doubted it would lead anywhere useful after so many. Mom said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. We know what we did was wrong. We've known it for years. But we love you, and we can't regret having you in our lives, even if the circumstances were terrible. I pulled my hand away. Karen Williams regrets not having me in her life. She's spent 23 years wondering if her daughter was alive, wondering if she'd ever see me again. We know, Dad said, and we're sorry for that pain. But we can't undo what was done. You could have told me the truth years ago. You could have helped me find my biological family, and lose you. Mom's voice was raw with pain. We couldn't risk that, so you chose to let Karen Williams suffer instead. They had no answer for that, because there wasn't a good answer. They had made a selfish choice, prioritizing their own happiness over the grief of a stranger. It was human and understandable, and completely unforgivable. I stood up from the table, feeling like I was leaving something behind that I could never recover. I'm meeting Karen tomorrow, I said. Are you going to tell her about us? Dad asked. I don't know yet. Mom said, whatever happens next, please know that every day of the last 23 years has been a gift. You've been the best thing in our lives. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. At the front door, I turned back to look at them one more time. They looked small and fragile, like people who had just confessed their worst secret, and were waiting to learn the consequences. I need time, I said.
Understand. I don't know what our relationship looks like now. We'll accept whatever you decide. I drove home through familiar Phoenix streets that suddenly felt foreign, past landmarks that belonged to Maya Thompson's life but might not have any meaning for Eleanor Williams.
I was caught between two identities, two families, two versions of the truth, and I had no idea how to reconcile them. The next morning, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror trying to decide who I was supposed to be for this meeting. Maya, the marketing coordinator who had grown up loved and stable in Phoenix, or Eleanor, the missing child who had finally been found. I settled on something in between, wearing a blue dress that brought out my eyes and hoping Karen Williams would see something familiar in the woman I'd become. The restaurant was busy with Saturday lunch crowds, families and couples enjoying weekend meals without the weight of life-changing revelations hanging over their conversations. I spotted Karen immediately, sitting alone at a corner table, her hands folded in front of her like she was praying. When she saw me approaching, she stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving my face. For a moment we just looked at each other, two women separated by 23 years of questions finally meeting in the space where answers lived. "Ellie," she whispered, and I knew without a doubt that this was my mother. She opened her arms tentatively, asking permission, and I stepped into a hug that felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. She smelled like vanilla and something floral, completely different from Mom's perfume, but somehow right in a way I couldn't explain. We talked for hours, sharing stories that filled in the gaps between who I'd been and who I'd become. Karen showed me photos on her phone, my childhood bedroom, exactly as I'd left it, with a toddler bed and walls covered in stickers. Pictures of birthday parties I'd missed, Christmas mornings that had happened without me, family gatherings where my absence was a visible wound. "I brought something for you," she said, pulling a small box from her purse. Inside was a silver bracelet with a tiny elephant charm. "You wore this every day until you disappeared." I had it engraved. I turned the charm over and read the inscription, "Eleanor, my brave girl. Love, Mama." The sight of it triggered another memory fragment, small hands reaching for shiny jewelry, the satisfaction of hearing the clasp click closed. I put the bracelet on, and it fit perfectly, like it had been waiting 23 years to return to my wrist. "Karen, I need to tell you something about the people who raised me." Her expression became guarded, like she was preparing for news that might be difficult to hear. I told her everything: David and Linda's desperation to adopt, their willingness to believe convenient lies, their decision to prioritize their own desires over legal and moral considerations. I watched her face carefully, expecting anger or demands for justice, but instead I saw something that looked like understanding. "They loved you," she said when I finished. "Yes, but they took you from me." She was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd told her. "You know, for years I imagined terrible things. I thought maybe you'd been taken by someone who would hurt you, someone who would treat you badly. Knowing that you were loved, that you were safe and cared for, that's not nothing." Her generosity was overwhelming. "Aren't you angry?" "Oh, I'm furious," she said, but her voice was calm. "I'm angry about every birthday I missed, every bedtime story I didn't get to read, every scraped knee I wasn't there to kiss better. I'm angry about 23 years of not knowing if my daughter was alive. But you're here now. You're safe, you're healthy, you're this incredible woman I get to know. I can be angry about what was taken from me, and grateful for what I'm getting back." I started crying again, overwhelmed by her grace and forgiveness. "I don't know how to be your daughter and their daughter at the same time." "You don't have to choose," she said gently. "Love isn't finite. The fact that you love them doesn't diminish what we might build together." We made plans to meet again the following weekend, and she invited me to Sunday dinner at her house where I could meet the extended family I'd never known I had. Marcus would be there, along with aunts and uncles and cousins who had been mourning my absence for decades. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Karen asked one more question. "What name do you want me to use? Maya or Eleanor?" I thought about it for a moment. Maya for now. Eleanor feels like someone I need to get to know again. Over the following weeks, I began living a carefully balanced double life. I continued working, maintaining my friendships, and slowly rebuilding my relationship with David and Linda Thompson. They were in therapy, individually and as a couple, trying to process their role in my disappearance and the decades of silence that followed. Our conversations were difficult but necessary. They had to confront the reality that their happiness had come at an enormous cost to another family. I had to find a way to love them while acknowledging the pain their choices had caused. At the same time, I was getting to know the Williams family, learning about the life I might have lived, and the people who had never stopped missing me. Karen and I talked every few days, sharing stories and gradually building the relationship we'd been denied. Marcus and I discovered we had similar senses of humor and compatible political views. I met cousins who had my eyes, aunts who shared my love of hiking, uncles who told embarrassing stories about Karen's teenage years. It was messy and complicated and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also healing in ways I hadn't expected. I was learning to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that I had been loved by people who had acquired me through terrible means, that I belonged to a family I'd been stolen from, that my identity was both Maya Thompson and Eleanor Williams, that forgiveness and justice didn't always align neatly. 6 months after the DNA test party that changed everything, I legally changed my name to Maya Eleanor Thompson Williams. It was awkward and hyphenated and didn't fit easily on forms, but it honored both of my families and both of my identities. I still live in Phoenix, but I drive to Tucson most weekends to spend time with the Williams family. Karen and I are building something new, not trying to recreate the mother-daughter relationship we lost, but creating something that acknowledges where we've been and where we're going. David and Linda and I meet for dinner once a month. Our relationship will never be the same as it was before I learned the truth, but it's honest now in a way it never was before. They're still my parents in every way that matters, even if they weren't the parents I was supposed to have. The hardest part isn't choosing between families or managing complicated relationships. The hardest part is living with the knowledge that my happiness, my safety, my entire life was built on someone else's devastating loss. Karen lost 23 years with her daughter so that David and Linda could have 23 years with theirs. But I've also learned that healing doesn't require perfect justice. Sometimes it requires accepting imperfect situations and finding ways to move forward that honor both what was lost and what was gained. I can't give Karen back the years we missed, but I can give her the years we have left. I can't undo David and Linda's choices, but I can insist on honesty moving forward. I'm learning to live with complexity, to be comfortable with questions that don't have clean answers. I'm Maya Thompson Williams, a marketing coordinator in Phoenix who was once a missing child in Flagstaff. I'm someone's beloved daughter, and someone else's greatest loss, and someone else's miracle all at the same time. The DNA test party that was supposed to tell us if we were descended from royalty or serial killers taught me something more important, that identity isn't just about genetics or legal documentation or the stories we're told about our origins. It's about the choices we make about who we want to be and how we want to love the people who matter to us. I am both families' daughter, carrying the love and the pain and the complicated truths that connect us all. And for the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am. 2 years had passed since the DNA revelation that shattered my understanding of everything I thought I knew about myself, and I was standing in the kitchen of my new home in Tucson, watching Karen Williams teach my 6-year-old neighbor Sophia how to make chocolate chip cookies. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so wonderfully normal, that it almost made me forget how surreal my life had become. Sophia lived next door with her grandmother, Mrs. Rodriguez, and had developed the habit of wandering over whenever she smelled baking coming from our kitchen. Karen had embraced her role as the neighborhood cookie supplier, with the enthusiasm of someone who had missed decades of opportunities to spoil children. Watching her patiently guide Sophia's small hands as they measured flour, I could see glimpses of the mother I might have known if circumstances had been different. "Maya, can you help us reach the vanilla extract?" Karen called out, and I marveled at how natural it felt to be called that name in this context. Maya Thompson Williams was who I was now, an identity that bridged 2 families and acknowledged the full complexity of my story. The hyphenated surname felt cumbersome on official documents, but it represented something important about refusing to choose between the people who had shaped me. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, who was picking up his girlfriend Emma from the airport. They were flying in from Denver, where Marcus had taken a position as a mathematics professor at the University of Colorado. The distance meant we saw each other less frequently than when we were both in Arizona, but our relationship had deepened in ways that surprised both of us. We had developed the kind of sibling bond that felt both new and ancient, as if we were rediscovering something that had always existed beneath the surface. "Mom's making cookies again," I texted back, using the name that had gradually become natural when referring to Karen. It had taken months to feel comfortable with that designation, not because Karen didn't deserve it, but because it felt like a betrayal of Linda Thompson. Time and therapy had helped me understand that love wasn't a finite resource, that claiming my relationship with my biological mother didn't diminish what I'd shared with the woman who had raised me. "Save some for us,"
Emma's been asking about those snickerdoodles since Christmas. Emma Chen was a pediatric nurse who shared Marcus's dry sense of humor and his passion for helping children. She joined our family gatherings with the kind of easy acceptance that suggested she understood the complicated dynamics without needing detailed explanations. Her presence had been particularly meaningful for Karen, who seemed to delight in the possibility of future grandchildren and the expansion of our rediscovered family unit. As I helped Sophia measure chocolate chips, my mind wandered to the phone conversation I'd had with Detective Rodriguez the previous week. The investigation into the child trafficking network that had separated me from my biological family had finally concluded with the sentencing of the last remaining conspirators. 17 families had been reunited with missing children, though not all of those reunions had resulted in ongoing relationships. Some adult children had chosen to maintain their established family structures while acknowledging their biological origins. Others had completely severed ties with their adoptive families and attempted to rebuild their lives around their genetic connections. Each situation is unique, Detective Rodriguez had explained. There's no right or wrong way to handle discovering that your entire childhood was built on criminal activity. Some people need to completely start over, others find ways to integrate both realities. I had fallen somewhere in the middle, maintaining careful contact with David and Linda Thompson while building new relationships with the Williams family. It was messy and sometimes painful, but it felt honest in a way that my previous life never had. The Thompsons were serving their community service sentences at a nonprofit organization that supported families of missing children, work that was both appropriate penance and genuinely helpful to people dealing with similar traumas. My relationship with them had evolved into something that resembled friendship more than traditional parent-child dynamics. We met for dinner once every few months, exchanged birthday cards and holiday greetings, and maintained the kind of polite but genuine affection that acknowledged our shared history while accepting its complicated foundation. Linda had started therapy to process her role in my disappearance, and David had become an advocate for adoption reform, using his experience to help other couples avoid the mistakes they had made. "They love you," Karen had said after one of my visits to Phoenix. "I can see it in the way they talk about you, the way they light up when you call. I used to hate them for taking you away from me, but I'm grateful now that you were with people who genuinely cared about your well-being." Her generosity continued to amaze me. The woman who had lost 24 years with her daughter had somehow found the grace to be thankful that those years had been spent with loving, if misguided parents rather than in a situation that might have caused real harm. It was a perspective that had taken me longer to develop, and one that had required extensive therapy to achieve. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the trauma specialist I'd been seeing since the media circus surrounding my case had died down, had helped me understand that healing didn't require forgiveness in any traditional sense. Instead, it required acceptance of complexity and the development of coping strategies for living with multiple competing truths. I could acknowledge that David and Linda Thompson had saved me from whatever would have happened if Bill Henderson's network had placed me elsewhere, while also recognizing that their actions had caused devastating pain to my biological family. Trauma resolution isn't about creating a neat narrative. Dr. Martinez had explained during one of our sessions. It's about learning to hold seemingly contradictory realities without being paralyzed by the cognitive dissonance. You can be grateful for your upbringing while being angry about how it was obtained. You can love your adoptive parents while grieving the loss of your childhood with your biological family. The work was ongoing and sometimes exhausting, but it had given me tools for navigating the complicated emotional landscape of my situation. I'd also started facilitating a support group for other adult children who had discovered similar deceptions about their origins. The group met monthly at a community center in Phoenix, bringing together people whose stories shared common themes of identity disruption, family secrets, and the challenge of rebuilding relationships on foundations of honesty rather than comfortable lies. Sophia finished adding chocolate chips to the cookie dough and looked up at Karen with the kind of adoring expression that children reserve for adults who take them seriously. "Can we make heart shapes?" "Of course we can make heart shapes," Karen replied, already reaching for the cookie cutters she kept in a drawer, specifically for such requests. "Maya, do you remember making heart-shaped cookies when you were little?" The question was asked casually, but I knew Karen was fishing for recovered memories that might fill in some of the gaps from my missing childhood. These moments happened regularly, gentle probes that hoped to uncover fragments of our lost years together.
Sometimes they triggered actual memories, brief flashes of sensation or emotion that felt authentic. More often, they produced nothing, and I had learned to be comfortable with the empty spaces where my early life should have been. Not really, I said, but I'd like to make them now. This had become my standard response to questions about my childhood with the Williams family. I couldn't recover what was lost, but I could participate in creating new experiences that honored both our history and our present relationship. Karen had learned to accept this approach, finding joy in shared activities rather than mourning the memories that would never be restored. My work as a communications coordinator for the Arizona Center for Missing Children had introduced me to dozens of families dealing with various forms of child displacement. Some cases involved traditional kidnappings, others dealt with parental abduction during custody disputes, and still others focused on children who had aged out of foster care without stable family connections. The common thread was the devastating impact of separation and the complex emotions involved in potential reunification. Every family handles reunion differently. My supervisor, Janet Williams, had explained during my first week on the job. Janet shared a surname with my biological family, but no actual relation, a coincidence that had initially felt strange but had become just another quirk of my current life. Some families can't bridge the gap created by years of separation, others find that the reunion exceeds their expectations. Most fall somewhere in between. The job was emotionally challenging but professionally rewarding, allowing me to use my personal experience to help other families navigate similar situations. I'd become particularly skilled at talking to adult children who were considering reaching out to biological relatives, sharing my story while emphasizing that each situation required individual consideration. There's no timeline for these decisions, I would tell them. Take whatever time you need to process the information and decide what's right for your specific circumstances. Reunion isn't mandatory just because DNA says you're related to someone. Marcus arrived with Emma just as the first batch of cookies was coming out of the oven, and the kitchen filled with the kind of chaotic warmth that I'd come to associate with Williams' family gatherings. Emma immediately gravitated toward Sophia, admiring her heart-shaped creations and asking detailed questions about the baking process that made the little girl beam with pride. "How's the new job treating you?" Karen asked Marcus as she transferred cookies to a cooling rack. "It's good. Different from high school teaching, but I'm enjoying the research opportunities." Marcus had always been passionate about mathematics education, and his position at the university allowed him to study how trauma affected learning in adolescence. The research was partially inspired by his own experience of losing his sister at age 7, and he hoped to develop teaching strategies that could help other children who were dealing with family disruption. Any interesting findings so far? Quite a few, actually. It turns out that stable family relationships are one of the strongest predictors of academic recovery after trauma. Children who maintain connections to consistent adults tend to regain their academic momentum more quickly than those who experience ongoing family instability. I thought about my own educational experience, how David and Linda Thompson had prioritized my schooling and provided the kind of steady support that allowed me to thrive academically. Their love might have been based on illegal actions, but it had given me tools that had shaped my adult life in positive ways. The complexity of that reality continued to challenge any attempt to classify them as purely victims or villains. Emma was showing Sophia how to pipe decorative frosting onto the cooled cookies, her nursing background evident in the patient way she guided the child's unsteady hands. "Have you thought about having kids?" I asked Marcus quietly while the others were focused on cookie decoration. "We've talked about it. Emma's great with children, obviously, and I think I'd like the chance to be the kind of father figure I needed when I was dealing with losing you." He paused, watching his girlfriend help Sophia create elaborate swirls of blue and green frosting. "What about you? Do you want children?" The question was one I'd been avoiding, even in therapy. The idea of becoming a parent myself felt loaded with complications I wasn't sure I was ready to address. What would I tell my children about their family history? How would I explain the grandmother who had raised me versus the grandmother who had given birth to me? What if my children inherited my own tendency toward identity confusion? "I think so," I said finally. "But it feels complicated, given everything that's happened." "Everything feels complicated now," Marcus replied. "But maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe complicated is more honest than the simple stories we used to tell ourselves." Later that evening, after Marcus and Emma had returned to their hotel and Sophia had been collected by her grandmother, Karen and I sat on the back patio, watching the sunset paint the Sonoran Desert in shades of orange and purple. These quiet moments had become some of my favorites, opportunities to talk without the structure of planned activities or the presence of other people who might need explanations about our unusual family dynamics. "I got a call from a documentary producer today," Karen said, her tone carefully neutral. "About our case, about missing children cases that ended in reunion. She's interested in filming families who have been brought back together through DNA testing and other investigative techniques." I felt my stomach clench. The media attention during the initial investigation and trial had been overwhelming, and I'd been grateful when public interest had finally moved on to other stories. The idea of inviting cameras back into our lives, of having our private healing process transformed into entertainment content, felt deeply uncomfortable. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd need to discuss it with you and Marcus before making any decisions. But Maya, I think it might be worth considering." Why? Karen was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because there are other families out there dealing with similar situations, and most of them don't have the resources we've had access to. The legal support, the therapy, the media attention that helps solve other cases. If sharing our story could help even one family find their missing child, it might be worth the invasion of privacy." I understood her perspective, and part of me agreed with the potential value of using our experience to help others. But I also felt protective of the fragile stability we'd built over the past 2 years. Our family relationships were still evolving, still learning to accommodate the complexities of our situation. Adding cameras and outside scrutiny felt like it could jeopardize the progress we'd made. "Can I think about it?" "Of course, there's no pressure from me either way. I just wanted you to know about the opportunity." That night, I called Dr. Martinez to discuss the documentary proposal and my conflicted feelings about participating. She listened patiently as I outlined my concerns about privacy, family stability, and the potential for our story to be sensationalized or misrepresented. "What feels most important to you right now?" she asked when I finished explaining the situation. "Protecting the relationships we've built, making sure that Marcus and Emma feel comfortable, that Karen doesn't get overwhelmed by attention, that David and Linda don't get further vilified by media coverage. Those are all valid concerns. But I also hear something else in your voice when you talk about this." "What is it?" I thought for a moment before answering. "I guess I feel like our story could help other people, but I'm afraid of what participation might cost us personally." "That's a reasonable fear. Can you think of any conditions that might make participation feel safer?" Over the following week, I had conversations with everyone in both of my families about the documentary proposal. Marcus was initially skeptical but became more interested when the producer agreed to focus on the investigative aspects of missing children cases, rather than the emotional drama of family reunion. Emma was supportive but insisted on maintaining her privacy as someone who had joined the family after the initial trauma. David and Linda were hesitant to participate but agreed to consider it if their involvement could help prevent other couples from making similar mistakes. The producer, a woman named Rachel Torres, who had previous experience with sensitive family stories, agreed to a preliminary meeting where we could discuss boundaries and editorial control. She impressed us with her knowledge of missing children cases and her commitment to representing our story accurately rather than sensationally. "I'm not interested in creating a tearjerker," she explained during our meeting at Karen's house. "I want to focus on the investigative work that led to solving multiple cases and the systemic changes that might prevent similar trafficking networks from operating in the future." The conversation was reassuring, but I still felt uncertain about exposing our private healing process to public scrutiny. It was Marcus who ultimately convinced me to participate, pointing out that our story had the potential to generate leads in other missing children cases and to educate families about the warning signs of illegal adoption schemes. "We've been given a platform whether we want it or not," he said. "The question is whether we use it responsibly to help other people, or whether we waste the opportunity because we're afraid of being uncomfortable." 3 months later, I was sitting in a professional lighting setup in Karen's living room, wearing a microphone and facing a camera operated by a cinematographer who specialized in documentary work. The interview process was less invasive than I'd expected, focusing on factual details about the investigation and the systemic issues that had allowed Bill Henderson's network to operate for years. Rachel Torres asked thoughtful questions about identity, family relationships, and the challenges of rebuilding trust after deception, but she avoided the kind of exploitative emotional manipulation that I'd feared. The conversations felt more like extended therapy sessions than television interviews, and I found myself sharing insights about healing and resilience that I hadn't fully articulated before. What would you want other people in similar situations to know? Rachel asked near the end of my interview. That there's no right way to handle discovering that your family history isn't what you thought it was, I said. Some people will want to completely rebuild their lives around their biological connections. Others will decide to maintain their existing relationships while acknowledging the truth about their origins. Both choices are valid, and neither one is permanent. You can change your mind as you grow and heal. The documentary filming process took 6 months, during which camera crews periodically visited Tucson to capture our daily lives and family interactions. Sophia, my young neighbor, was thrilled to be included in the background of several scenes, and her grandmother, Mrs. Rodriguez, signed releases, allowing her participation after being assured that the focus
would remain on the missing children advocacy work rather than personal drama. Karen proved to be a natural on camera, speaking eloquently about the experience of losing a child and the importance of never giving up hope. Her interviews were powerful testimonies to parental love and determination, and I could see why Rachel Torres was excited about including her perspective in the final documentary. Marcus struggled more with the filming process, finding it difficult to discuss his memories of losing his little sister while cameras captured his emotional responses. But his insights about the long-term impact of childhood trauma and the importance of sibling relationships added depth to the documentary's exploration of how missing children cases affect entire families. The most challenging interviews involved David and Linda Thompson, who agreed to participate despite their understandable reluctance to further expose their role in my disappearance. Their conversations with Rachel Torres were painful to watch, as they grappled with accepting responsibility for their actions while maintaining their love for the daughter they had raised. "We can't undo what we did," Linda said during one particularly difficult interview. "But we can try to prevent other couples from making the same mistakes by sharing what we learned about the warning signs of illegal adoption schemes." Their participation required enormous courage, and I felt a renewed respect for their willingness to sacrifice their privacy and reputation in service of helping other families avoid similar situations. It was another example of the complicated nature of our relationships, where the people who had caused tremendous pain were also capable of meaningful attempts at redemption. The documentary premiered at the Phoenix Film Festival 18 months after filming began, and our entire extended family attended the screening together. Sitting in a darkened theater watching our story unfold on screen was surreal and emotionally overwhelming, but the final product exceeded my expectations for sensitivity and educational value. Finding Eleanor, a missing child investigation focused primarily on the detective work that had solved multiple cases and the systemic changes that had been implemented to prevent similar trafficking networks. Our family relationships were presented honestly, but without sensationalism, and the emphasis remained on the broader implications for missing children advocacy rather than the personal drama of reunion. The documentary generated significant media attention and helped raise awareness about the warning signs of illegal adoption schemes. More importantly, it produced concrete results in terms of new leads in other missing children cases. Within 6 months of the broadcast, 3 additional families had been reunited with missing relatives, and law enforcement agencies reported increased cooperation from couples who suspected their own adoptions might not have been entirely legal. "This is what makes it all worthwhile," Detective Rodriguez told me during a follow-up interview about the documentary's impact. "When a single case can generate this kind of positive outcome for multiple families, it justifies all the difficult work that went into the original investigation." 5 years after the DNA party that changed my life, I was standing in the nursery of my new home in Tucson, assembling a crib while Karen Williams supervised from the doorway. My pregnancy had been a surprise, the result of a relationship with a fellow advocate named David Chen who worked for a nonprofit organization focused on family reunification. The coincidence of his first name matching my adoptive father's had initially felt awkward, but time had reduced it to just another quirk in my complicated life story. "Are you nervous about becoming a mother?" Karen asked, as I struggled with the crib instruction manual. "Terrified," I admitted. What if I don't know how to love a child properly? What if I pass on some kind of identity confusion to my daughter? Maya, you've spent the last 5 years learning how to build healthy relationships in incredibly difficult circumstances. You've developed skills for handling complexity and maintaining connections with people who love you in different ways. Those are exactly the skills that make someone a good parent. The baby kicked as if responding to our conversation, and I placed my hand on my swollen belly, marveling at the life growing inside me. This child would grow up knowing her full family history from the beginning, with relationships to both the Williams and Thompson sides of her extended family. She would never experience the identity disruption that had defined my adult life, but she would inherit the complexity that came with being part of a family built on both love and trauma. What are you going to tell her about all of this? Karen asked, voicing the question I'd been contemplating for months. The truth, adapted for her developmental stage, that families are complicated, that love doesn't always follow legal or biological lines, that sometimes the people who hurt us are also people who care about us. I paused, thinking about the lessons I'd learned through years of therapy and relationship building, and that identity isn't just about where you come from, but about the choices you make about who you want to be. My daughter would grow up calling Karen Grandma Karen and Linda Thompson Grandma Linda, with clear distinctions that acknowledge their different roles in our family history. She would learn about her Uncle Marcus and Aunt Emma, and eventually about the documentary that had helped other families find their missing children. She would understand that her family's story was unusual but not shameful, complex but not broken. David Chen arrived home from work as I was finishing the crib assembly, and he immediately moved to help with the final steps. His patient, methodical approach to complicated tasks was one of the qualities that had initially attracted me to him, along with his understanding of family trauma and his commitment to helping children maintain connections to their cultural and biological heritage. "How did the pediatrician appointment go?" he asked, placing his hands on my belly to feel for movement. "Everything looks good. She's measuring right on schedule, and Dr. Williams thinks we're looking at a delivery sometime in the next 2 weeks." Sarah Williams, my obstetrician, shared yet another surname connection with my biological family, though this one was purely coincidental. The universe seemed to enjoy these small ironies, constantly reminding me of the ways that names and identities could be both meaningful and arbitrary. That evening, I called Marcus and Emma in Denver to update them on the pregnancy progress and to finalize their travel plans for the birth. They had become the kind of siblings I'd never expected to have, providing support and perspective that helped me navigate the ongoing challenges of maintaining relationships with multiple families. "Are you ready for this?" Emma asked during our video call. "I don't think anyone's ever really ready to become a parent," I replied, "but I'm ready to try." "You're going to be amazing," Marcus said. "This baby is going to be so lucky to have a mother who understands the importance of honesty and the complexity of love." 2 weeks later, I was holding my daughter Elena Rose Chen Williams in the hospital room, surrounded by both of my families. Karen Williams sat in the chair next to my bed, tears streaming down her face as she held her first grandchild. David and Linda Thompson stood nearby, their expressions mixing joy with the bittersweet recognition of their complicated role in our family's story. Marcus and Emma had driven down from Denver and were taking turns photographing every moment of Elena's first day. David Chen was handling calls from well-wishers while trying to process his new role as a father. The room was full of love and complexity, exactly the kind of environment I hoped to create for my daughter throughout her childhood. "She's beautiful," Linda Thompson whispered, gently touching Elena's tiny hand. "She looks like you did when you were a baby." The comment was probably meant as a simple observation, but it carried deeper implications about genetic inheritance and family resemblance that had once been sources of confusion in my own life. Elena would grow up understanding both her biological heritage and her chosen family connections, with access to medical history and genetic information that had been hidden from me during my childhood. "What does her name mean?" Karen asked, studying her granddaughter's face with the intensity of someone who was memorizing every detail. "Elena is Spanish for bright light," I explained, "and Rose was my biological grandmother's middle name, according to the family tree Marcus helped me research." Elena Rose Chen Williams represented the integration of all the different aspects of my identity, honoring both my Hispanic heritage through David Chen's family and my connection to the Williams lineage. Her hyphenated surname was even more cumbersome than my own, but it told the story of a family that had been built across cultural and biological lines through choice rather than deception. As I watched my daughter sleep in her first hours of life, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The DNA party that had shattered my understanding of my identity had ultimately led me to this room full of people who loved Elena unconditionally. The pain of discovering that my childhood had been built on lies had somehow transformed into the joy of creating a new generation that would grow up with truth as its foundation. Dr. Martinez had been right about trauma resolution requiring acceptance of complexity rather than the creation of neat narratives. My story didn't have a simple ending where everything was resolved and everyone lived happily ever after. Instead, it had an ongoing middle where relationships continued to evolve and healing remained a daily practice rather than a final destination. Elena stirred in my arms, opening her eyes for a brief moment before settling back into sleep. In that instant, I saw the future spreading out before us. Birthday parties attended by both sets of grandparents, family stories that acknowledged difficult truths, a childhood built on honesty rather than comfortable lies. She would grow up knowing that families could be complicated without being broken, that love could exist alongside loss, and that identity was something to be claimed and chosen rather than simply inherited. Most importantly, she would never have to discover that the people she trusted had been keeping secrets about her origins. My name was Maya Thompson Williams, mother of Elena Rose Chen Williams, daughter of Karen Williams and David and Linda Thompson, advocate for missing children and their families. I was exactly who I was supposed to be, even if it had taken 29 years and a DNA test to figure that out. 20 years after that DNA party changed my life, I stood in the kitchen of my daughter Elena's new apartment in Portland, helping her unpack boxes as she prepared to start her doctoral program in family psychology. At 26, she had already established herself as a respected researcher in trauma recovery, with a particular focus on identity reconstruction after family disruption. "Mom, look at this," Elena said, pulling a framed photo from one of the boxes. It was a picture from her college graduation 5 years earlier, showing our entire extended family gathered together: Karen Williams, now 88, but still sharp and engaged; David and Linda Thompson, in their late 70s, but determined to remain part of Elena's life; Marcus and Emma, with their 3 children, David Chen with his characteristic proud smile, and me standing in the center of a group that represented 2 decades of intentional relationship building. "I want to put this on my desk at the university," Elena continued. "When I'm working with families dealing with reunion situations, I want them to see that complex relationships can work if everyone is committed to honesty and healing." Elena's dissertation research focused on intergenerational trauma transmission and recovery, examining how families could break cycles of deception and build healthier communication patterns. Her work was being funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, and several major universities had already expressed interest in her findings. "Have you decided what you want to focus on for your postdoctoral work?" I asked, admiring the way she had already made the small apartment feel like home. "I'm thinking about developing intervention protocols for families dealing with DNA discovery situations," she said. "There are so many people finding out about adoptions, paternity issues, and family secrets through genetic testing, but there aren't standardized therapeutic approaches for helping them process those revelations." It was exactly the kind of work that would honor our family's experience while serving a broader purpose. Elena had grown up watching our family navigate complex relationships, and she had developed an intuitive understanding of how to maintain connections across biological and chosen family lines. My phone buzzed with a text from Karen Williams, who was now living in an assisted living facility but maintained her independence and continued her advocacy work through video calls and online support groups. "Tell Elena I'm proud of her. The documentary crew wants to interview me next week about the 20-year follow-up project." Rachel Torres was indeed working on a 3rd documentary about our case, this one examining the long-term impacts of the investigation and the policy changes that had emerged from our story. The National Center for Missing Children had implemented dozens of protocol improvements based on recommendations from our case, and law enforcement agencies across the country now used our story as a training example. "Abuela Karen is excited about the new documentary," I told Elena, showing her the text message. "I still can't believe how much has changed because of that one DNA test you took," Elena said, settling onto her couch with a cup of tea. "Sometimes I try to imagine what would have happened if you had never found out the truth." It was a question I had considered many times over the years. Would I have eventually discovered my origins through medical necessity or family crisis?
Would Elena have grown up with the same sense of security and identity if she had been raised on a foundation of incomplete information? Would the dozens of other families who had been reunited through leads from our case have ever found each other? I think the truth would have come out eventually, I said. But I'm grateful it happened when it did, when we had the resources and support to handle it properly. Elena nodded, understanding the complexity of that statement. She had grown up knowing that her family's trauma had been transformed into something that served a larger purpose, that our willingness to share our story had created resources for other people dealing with similar situations. I got a call from a family in Michigan yesterday. I continued. Their teenage daughter just found out through genetic testing that her father isn't her biological parent. They want to know how to handle the conversation with her biological father's family. These calls came regularly now, from families across the country who had heard about our case and were seeking guidance for their own situations. The Southwest Center for Family Reunification, which I had directed for the past decade, maintained a network of counselors and advocates who specialized in DNA discovery situations. What did you tell them? The same thing I tell everyone: take it slow, prioritize the child's emotional well-being, and don't make any permanent decisions while everyone is still processing the initial shock. Most importantly, remember that these revelations create opportunities for deeper honesty and stronger relationships if they're handled thoughtfully. Elena was taking notes on her laptop as I spoke, probably incorporating our conversation into her research data. She had been studying our family's experience since college, treating it as both personal history and academic case study. Mom, can I ask you something I've never asked before? Of course. Do you ever feel angry about what happened? Not just disappointed or sad, but genuinely angry that your childhood was built on lies. It was a direct question that cut to the heart of my emotional experience, and I appreciated Elena's willingness to ask it. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm angry that Karen Williams lost 24 years with her daughter. I'm angry that David and Linda Thompson convinced themselves that love justified theft. I'm angry that Bill Henderson and his network profited from separating families. But I'm also grateful for the life I had, the education I received, the opportunities I was given. I'm grateful for you, and you couldn't exist if my story had been different. I'm grateful for the advocacy work that emerged from our experience, and the families who have been helped because we shared our story. Elena nodded, understanding that complex emotions didn't need to be resolved into simple categories. She had grown up learning that it was possible to hold multiple feelings simultaneously, that healing didn't require choosing between gratitude and anger. That evening, we video called with the rest of our extended family for our monthly check-in, a tradition that had started during the pandemic and had continued as a way of maintaining connections across geographical distances. Karen Williams joined from her assisted living facility, Marcus and Emma connected from Denver with their teenagers, and David Chen called in from a conference in San Francisco, where he was speaking about immigration and family separation. I have news, Marcus announced once everyone was on the call. The university has approved my sabbatical proposal. I'm going to spend next year traveling to different countries to study how various cultures handle family reunification after separation. That's wonderful, Karen said, her face lighting up with pride. Your research has already helped so many families here. It will be amazing to see how it can be applied internationally. As we talked about travel plans and research opportunities, I reflected on how far our family had come from that devastating DNA revelation 20 years earlier. We had transformed trauma into purpose, pain into advocacy, and separation into a deeper understanding of how families could be rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than convenient lies. When the call ended, Elena and I sat in comfortable silence, processing the conversation and enjoying the peaceful evening in her new city. Tomorrow she would begin her doctoral program, continuing the work of helping families heal from separation and deception. In a few months, I would retire from the Reunification Center, confident that the programs we had built would continue serving families long after my involvement ended. Thank you, Elena said, as I prepared to leave for my hotel. For what? For choosing truth over comfort. For building a family that values honesty even when it's difficult. For showing me that identity is something you claim, rather than something that's imposed on you. As I hugged my daughter goodbye, I thought about the DNA test that had shattered my understanding of who I was, and ultimately revealed who I was meant to become. 20 years later, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by people who loved me authentically, engaged in work that honored our experience while serving others, and proud of a daughter who would continue transforming personal trauma into social healing. My name is Maya Thompson Williams, and I am grateful for every complicated, beautiful, difficult moment of the journey that brought me here. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.